In this video, you will discover the exact lie society sold you about your limits, and you will feel the first tectonic shift beneath the floor of your current reality. Did you believe society when they told you that your life is a fixed plot of land with finite dimensions? That the walls you see around you are the full extent of your territory? That the materials in your hands are all you will ever inherit? That the sun sets at a predetermined hour on your ambition? That your name is written in temporary ink? That your legacy must fit inside a frame built by those who came before? That the blueprints are sealed and cannot be revised? That the height of your tower is measured by numbers on a bank statement? That the depth of your foundation is determined by your education? That the width of your influence is confined to your zip code? That the rooms of your life are already furnished by expectation? That the windows only face the past? That the door was locked the day you were born? And that the architect has retired, leaving you alone with a hammer and no nails? This is where it begins. The moment you realize that the walls are not stone but suggestion, that the roof is not shelter but a ceiling of consented limitation, that the floor beneath you is not earth but the compressed sediment of inherited belief, that the blueprint you have been following bears the watermark of a culture terrified of eternity, that the construction site of your existence has been surveyed by surveyors who cannot see the horizon, that the permits you sought were issued by minds who never dared to build, that the building code was written to produce uniformity, not cathedrals. And in this video, you will feel the precise second when the blueprint trembles in your hands and the ink begins to run. For what is about to form on the page is not a revision, but a resurrection, not an addition, but an infinite expansion, not a house, but a universe compressed into the shape of your life. And you will understand that the only permit required to build for eternity is the audacity to imagine that you already have. Can you imagine that before your hands ever held a tool, before your eyes learned to measure distance, before your ears absorbed the noise of what is possible and what is not, there existed a scroll unfurled in the silence of your infant consciousness, a document not written by society, but etched by the very force that spins galaxies into ordered spirals. And this blueprint contained no mention of mortgage payments or retirement funds or the square footage of your social standing, but instead depicted a structure so vast that its corridors stretch through dimensions you have not yet named, its windows opening onto vistas of creation you have forgotten you once inhabited, its foundation anchored not in currency, but in the substance of imagination itself. This is where the error occurred. Not in the building, but in the belief that the original plans were lost. Because the truth is that you folded that scroll and placed it in the marrow of your bones. You buried it beneath the debris of compulsory education and the scaffolding of parental expectation. You mistook the temporary shack you were told to construct for the eternal palace you were born to occupy. And yet, every time you close your eyes and envision a life unbound by circumstance, every time your heart races at the thought of a future that has not yet been approved by consensus, every time you catch yourself dreaming of a room that does not exist in any real estate listing, you are not fantasizing, you are remembering. This is how it unfolds. The scroll begins to unfurl from within, its edges glowing with the phosphorescence of original knowledge, and you realize that the blueprint you were born with is not a set of instructions, but a living memory of who you have always been. That the lines on the page are not drawn with ink, but with the trajectory of your deepest longing. That the dimensions are not measured in feet, but in the intensity with which you dare to desire. That the materials specified are not wood and stone, but conviction and persistence. That the architect who signed the corner did not use a name you would recognize because the signature is simply your face reflected in still water. And as the layers peel back, you start to see that every failure was not a collapse, but a necessary excavation. Every detour was not a mistake, but a corridor you had to traverse to retrieve a lost tool. Every pause was not stagnation, but the silent accumulation of force before the rise. Suppose you discover that the blueprint has been inside your ribcage all along, that your breath is the wind measuring the height of your proposed tower, that your pulse is the rhythm of hammers yet to fall, that your spine is the plumb line against which true vertical is measured, and that the version of you who already lives in the completed structure is not a future self, but the original occupant, who has been waiting patiently in the foyer of your imagination for you to finally turn the key. But that was only the beginning. Because the moment you acknowledge the existence of the original blueprint, the moment you cease building from the borrowed plans laid across your desk by a world that profits from your smallness, the construction site of your life undergoes a sudden and irreversible seismic shift, and you understand that the ground beneath you was never solid ground at all. It was the compressed conviction of centuries telling you that you are finite, and now it is beginning to crack. Picture for a moment a child standing at the edge of a clearing, hands empty, eyes wide, the entire forest of possibilities stretching outward in every direction. And then an adult approaches not with malice, but with love, places a single brick in those small palms, and says, "This is who you are." And the child, trusting the giver, looks at the brick and begins to believe that the cool weight against their skin is identity rather than imposition, that the rough texture is the boundary of their becoming, that this single clay rectangle is not a suggestion, but a sentence, not a tool, but a verdict. This is where illusion first casts its foundation, not in cruelty, but in kindness, not in rejection, but in the desperate parental desire to protect a soft child from a hard world. And the brick is not a prison, but a promise of safety, not a wall, but a definition, and the child holds it through playground negotiations and classroom hierarchies, through the first failure and the first rejection, through the first time they look in a mirror and see not a face but a category, and the brick grows warmer with each handling, its edges smoothing under the repetitive friction of social confirmation, until one day the child is an adult standing on a plot of land they never chose, surrounded by thousands of identical bricks they have collected over decades, and they call this collection a life. Yet something deeper was waiting. And so the question is not why you built the wall, but why you never questioned the first brick. Not why you collected so many, but why you believed the collection was complete. Not why you defended the structure so fiercely, but why you never noticed that the bricks are labeled with adjectives you internalized before you had language to dispute them. Shy, difficult, average, dreamer too much, not enough, late bloomer, early burnout. And each brick is cemented not by mortar, but by the silent consent you gave every time you introduced yourself with the summary rather than the symphony. Every time you nodded when someone described your limitations as your personality. Every time you mistook a temporary condition for a permanent address. Think of the moment when you first reached for a brick that was not handed to you but chosen by you. When you picked up the weight of, "I am not the kind of person who," and laid it neatly atop the growing rampart. When you discovered that self-limitation is not only more comfortable than self-expansion, but it is positively reinforced by a society that prefers its architects predictable, its structures uniform, its blueprints already approved, and you became both the builder and the building, the prisoner and the guard, the wall and the walled. This is the turning point. You stand amid the accumulated masonry of your own consented confinement, the bricks now numbered in the thousands, the mortar cured to stone, the roof so low you have forgotten you were ever meant to stand upright. And yet, and this is the cruel genius of the first brick, you call this shelter, you call this security, you call this a life well constructed. And you never once look down at your hands and wonder what they might have built had they never been taught that the only honorable work is the endless repetition of laying limits. Ask yourself what happens when you finally turn one brick over and read the date stamped on its underside. When you realize that this particular limitation was installed on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd grade, that it was cemented by a throwaway comment from a relative you have not seen in 30 years. That it has been supporting the entire weight of your diminished existence ever since, and that it can be removed not with a jackhammer, but with the simple acknowledgement that you were the one who kept it there. But that was only the beginning. Because as your fingers find the edge of that first brick, As you test the ancient mortar with the tip of your imagination, you hear something shift deep within the wall. And it is not the sound of stone grinding against stone. It is the sound of your own forgotten voice, muffled for decades, asking permission to speak again. Now consider this, that every brick you have ever laid was held in place not by its own weight, but by a binding agent you did not manufacture. A gray slurry of parental hope and institutional approval and romantic validation and social currency. A mixture you spent your entire youth watching others stir and assumed you must also learn to make. And you dipped your trowel into the vats of expectation labeled success and worthiness and enough. Without ever asking who quarried the lime, or who fired the kiln, or who decided that this particular shade of gray was the only acceptable color for holding a life together. This is where the structure begins to reveal its hidden engineering. The mortar between your bricks is not your own. It was borrowed from a teacher who told you that good students earn gold stars, and you have been chasing asterisks ever since. It was borrowed from a parent who never built their own dream, and so could only teach you how to reinforce someone else's. It was borrowed from a lover who said, "I need you to be smaller," and you mistook compression for intimacy. It was borrowed from an employer who defined productivity as the slow surrender of your interiority. And the tragedy is not that you took the mortar, but that you believed it was the only adhesive in existence. That your hands were incapable of formulating a binding agent from the raw materials of your own imagination. That without the constant application of external validation, your entire construction would collapse into an unrecognizable heap of unaffiliated bricks. This is how the weight accumulates. Not through the mass of the stones, but through the density of the borrowed belief holding them together. And you feel this weight, not as oppression, but as responsibility. Not as burden, but as duty. Not as theft, but as love. And so you continue stirring, continue spreading, continue smoothing the gray paste over the gaps in your existence. And you call this maintenance. You call this maturity. You call this being a functional adult in a world that rewards those who build according to the approved specifications. Yet something deeper was waiting, and so you must consider the possibility that the mortar you have been applying so diligently, the substance you believed was strengthening your structure, has actually been slowly petrifying the space between your bricks into something rigid and unyielding, that what you mistook for structural integrity was actually calcified flexibility. That the wall you thought was protecting you has been preventing the expansion and contraction that all living buildings require. That you have sealed yourself so tightly against the weather of criticism and rejection that no fresh air can enter and no new architecture can emerge. This is the revelation that arrives not as a shout, but as a whisper. The borrowed mortar is not only heavy, it is unnecessary, and the bricks themselves, when properly aligned by your own intention, will hold each other in place through the magnetic force of congruent desire, through the gravitational pull of a life oriented toward its own true north, through the simple fact that two stones cut from the same quarry of authentic longing will adhere more permanently than any amount of externally sourced paste could ever achieve. Envision a world where you set down the trowel, where you cease dipping into the communal vat of what you should want and who you should be, and how you should measure your progress, where you stand before your wall with empty hands, and finally acknowledge that the gray between your bricks is not mortar, but the compressed sediment of everyone else's unfinished business, and you begin with your bare fingers to scrape it away. This is where truth breaks through, as the first flecks of borrowed expectation fall to your feet, as the ancient adhesive surrenders to the pressure of your attention, as you reveal the clean edges of bricks you laid decades ago in moments of genuine alignment. You realize that the wall was never in danger of falling. It was in danger of never being seen clearly. And now that you see it, now that you distinguish between what you added and what was imposed, you understand that the weight was never the bricks, but the story that someone else's approval was the only thing strong enough to hold your life together. And that story is now dust on your fingertips. Suppose you discover that the most powerful force in construction is not the hammer, but the silence between swings. Not the addition of material, but the permission to let it fall away. Not the accumulation of years, but the sudden, sacred act of unbuilding. And you stand before the wall you have spent a lifetime reinforcing. The trowel finally at your feet, the borrowed mortar still drying on your palms, and you realize that the demolition you have feared, the collapse, the rubble, the exposure to elements you have been trained to dread, is not destruction, but excavation. Not loss, but recovery. Not the end of your shelter, but the beginning of your sky. This is how it unfolds. You do not swing a wrecking ball. You do not hire a crew. You do not announce to the neighbors that you are finally tearing down the structure they have always admired. Because silent demolition requires no noise, no spectacle, no external validation of the interior shift. And so you simply stop defending the wall. You cease applying fresh mortar to the cracks that form naturally in any structure built on borrowed foundations. You let the first brick loosen not through force, but through the simple cessation of belief in its necessity. And when it falls, not with a dramatic crash, but with a soft surrender of weight to gravity, you do not rush to replace it, but instead stand in the opening and feel, perhaps for the first time, the temperature of air that has not been filtered through the expectations of others. Think of the moment when you realize that the wall has been holding you up, not the other way around, that you have been leaning against this barrier your entire adult life, using it to prop up a version of yourself that cannot stand independently. And as the first bricks surrender their positions, as the gaps multiply across the facade, you do not weaken, you straighten, your spine rediscovering its original plumb, your weight redistributing from the wall to your own 2 feet, and you understand that the demolition is not something you are doing to yourself, but something you are finally allowing yourself to become. This is the turning point. You stop apologizing for the holes. You stop explaining to concerned onlookers that you are planning to repair the damage. You stop promising that the renovations are temporary and that the original structure will soon be restored. Because the truth that now moves through you with the force of revelation is that the damage is the renovation. The holes are the windows, the gaps are the doors, and what the world perceives as your collapse is actually your emergence from a building that was never designed to contain the full height of your becoming. Yet something deeper was waiting. And so you must recognize that the silent demolition is not a single event, but a continuous orientation. Not a moment of crisis, but a permanent posture of release, and that every day you will be presented with fresh opportunities to let another borrowed brick fall, another calcified belief crumble, another section of wall admit the light. And the question is not whether you have the strength to tear it all down at once, but whether you have the courage to leave the rubble where it lies and walk through the opening into a territory you have never surveyed. This is why it matters. Because the wall was never protecting you from the world. It was protecting the world from the full expression of who you are. And every brick that falls is a refusal to continue hiding your magnitude behind the polite facade of a life built to someone else's specifications. And the demolition is silent because the only witness required is the version of you who has been waiting on the other side, pressing against the stones from the outside, not to break in, but to remind you that there has never been a wall, only the illusion of separation between who you became and who you always were. Consider the possibility that the rubble at your feet is not debris but raw material, that the fallen bricks are not waste but resources finally liberated from their oppressive arrangement, that you can now pick up a stone that once confined you and see it not as a limitation, but as a component of a structure you have not yet imagined. And in your hands it is lighter than it has ever been, because it no longer carries the weight of your consent to be small. Ask yourself what happens when you have cleared enough debris, when enough bricks have fallen from the walls, when the borrowed mortar has been scraped from your fingertips, and the gray dust settles at your ankles, and you finally look up, not at the horizon you have been trained to seek, but directly above you. At the ceiling you have been bending beneath for so long that you forgot you were ever meant to stand upright. And there it is, a fracture so fine it could have been there for decades, a hairline seam in the plaster of your consented limitations, a thin, jagged line that catches the light from the new windows in your walls and refracts it into something you have never seen before. This is where the structure reveals its fatal flaw. The ceiling was never load-bearing, never engineered to withstand the rising pressure of an imagination that has remembered its original dimensions, never intended to be permanent, but only to serve as temporary protection while you gathered the materials to build higher. And you have been treating a scaffolding tarp as a finished roof, mistaking a construction phase for a completed life. And the crack is not damage. It is invitation. Picture for a moment that the ceiling is not made of plaster and lath, but of every prediction ever made about your limitations, every forecast that began with the words, "You'll never," every well-intentioned assessment of your ceiling height delivered by those who measured you against their own low rafters, and the crack running through it is the accumulated pressure of every moment you dared to imagine a taller version of yourself, every suppressed aspiration that rose like vapor and condensed against the cold surface of consensus reality, every silent "what if" that found no outlet except this slow, persistent widening of the seam above your head. This is how it unfolds. You do not create the crack. You simply stop ignoring it. You stop repairing it with fresh layers of denial. You stop painting over it with the beige emulsion of busyness and distraction and the endless maintenance of a life you have outgrown. And instead, you stand beneath it, craning your neck like a tourist in your own existence, watching as the fracture lengthens by millimeters, invisible to anyone else but seismic in your interior geography. This is the revelation that arrives not as thunder, but as the soft patter of plaster dust on your upturned face. The ceiling was never the limit of your reach, but the boundary of your consent. And the crack is not evidence of structural failure, but of structural truth. Not a problem to be solved, but a prophecy to be fulfilled. And every fleck of fallen plaster is a fragment of a prediction that has finally exhausted its authority over your life. Yet something deeper was waiting. And so you must understand that the crack in the ceiling is not separate from the demolition of the walls. It is the same movement of liberation expressed in a new dimension, the same refusal to remain contained now directed upward instead of outward, the same gravitational surrender of what no longer serves you now falling from above instead of beside. And as the walls admit the horizon and the ceiling admits the sky, you realize that your structure is becoming not a building but a viewpoint, not a shelter but a vantage, not an address but an orientation. Think of the moment when a single shard of plaster breaks free and tumbles through the amber light of your newly windowed room, spinning slowly like a leaf from a tree you did not know was rooted in your ribcage, and it lands at your feet with a sound softer than a whisper, and you recognize it. This is the prediction that you would never finish what you started. This is the forecast that your dreams were larger than your capacity. This is the assessment that you were not the kind of person who builds cathedrals, but the kind who maintains modest housing. And now it is rubble indistinguishable from the debris of your fallen walls. And you are standing in a room that has not yet decided whether it will remain a room or become a courtyard, a gallery, a launch pad, a ruin, or a foundation for something that has no name in any architectural textbook ever written. This is the turning point. The crack widens, not because you push against the ceiling, but because you finally stop holding it in place with the crown of your bowed head. You stop bracing against the weight of low expectations. You straighten your neck and release the ancient tension in your cervical vertebrae. And as your spine finds its full extension, as you stand to the height you were issued at birth but forgot was yours, the ceiling does not collapse, it simply becomes irrelevant. A membrane of outdated belief stretched across a sky that has always been waiting on the other side, and you are no longer a creature of interiors, but a being for whom the concept of a roof has become a memory rather than a condition. Envision a world where the fallen bricks and shattered plaster do not remain as rubble, but rise again, not as walls, but as something entirely different, not as confinement, but as access, not as boundary, but as bridge. And you look at the debris scattered across the floor of your unbounded existence, and realize that these materials have not lost their utility. They have only lost their arrangement. And the question is not what you will discard, but what you will build with the substance of your own liberated history. This is where imagination reveals itself, not as fantasy, but as the most practical tool in your possession, not as escape from reality, but as the only method for constructing a reality worth inhabiting. And you begin to see that every failed endeavor was not waste, but a beam cut to the wrong specifications. Every rejected version of yourself was not garbage, but a column placed in the wrong position. Every abandoned dream was not debris, but a stone that could not find its home in the structure you were previously attempting to raise. And now that the false building has fallen, now that the borrowed blueprints are ash and the borrowed mortar is dust, you stand amid the raw materials of your entire existence and ask not, what is possible, but what do I dare to imagine? This is how it unfolds. You pick up a brick that once held you in place, and you do not see a prison. You see a step, you see a foundation stone for a tower that has no terminus. You see a weight that can become an anchor for a suspension bridge, stretching toward a future that has not yet been surveyed. And in your hands, it is no longer a verdict, but a variable. No longer a conclusion, but a component. No longer the shape of your limitation, but the substance of your liberation. This is the scaffolding of imagination. The temporary, flexible, infinitely adjustable framework that rises not from external specifications, but from the internal geometry of your deepest longing. And it does not dictate the final form of the structure, but merely provides access to the heights where that form can be envisioned, and you climb it not run by cautious run, but with the vertiginous acceleration of a child who has discovered that the jungle gym was never locked, that the upper platforms were never off-limits, that the only thing preventing your ascent was the belief that the scaffolding was the building itself. Yet something deeper was waiting, and so you must recognize that imagination is not a faculty you possess, but an environment you inhabit. Not a tool you wield, but an element you breathe. Not something you activate on weekends and holidays, but the very atmosphere of your expanded existence. And as you climb the scaffolding of your own making, as you rise above the roofline of your former life, as you look down at the debris of your demolished limitations and see not loss but liberation, you understand that the height you are achieving was never the point. The point is the perspective. The point is the vista. The point is the sudden, sweeping realization that your former life was not a house but a diorama, not a shelter but a shoebox. And you were never meant to inhabit dioramas or dwell in shoeboxes, but to build at the scale of the horizon itself. Consider the possibility that the scaffolding is not temporary at all, but eternal, that imagination is not the means to an end, but the end itself, that the structure you have been attempting to complete was never meant to be completed, but to be perpetually reimagined, that the architect does not retire upon the ribbon cutting, but remains eternally on site. Blueprint forever unfurling, pencil forever sharpened, and the construction is not a project with a deadline, but a relationship with no terminus. This is why it matters, because the scaffolding of imagination does not merely elevate you to the next floor. It reveals that there are no floors, that the building is not a stack of discrete levels, but a continuous ascent, that the distinction between ground and summit is an illusion sustained by those who have never climbed high enough to see the curvature of their own potential. And from this height, from this trembling platform of pure possibility, you can finally see what the original blueprint always depicted. Not a structure but a trajectory, not an edifice but an orientation, not a destination but an infinite becoming. Think of the moment when you realize that the scaffolding is not outside you but inside you, that the bars and planks are not steel and wood, but the tensile strength of your own revised self-concept, that the height you have achieved is not measured in feet, but in the distance between who you were when you woke this morning and who you have already become in the time it took to climb this sentence. And the platform beneath you is not stable, because stability is no longer the goal. The goal is the next handhold, the next run, the next impossible elevation that becomes possible the moment you imagine yourself already standing there. This is the turning point. You stop asking whether the scaffolding will hold and start asking where you will climb next. You stop testing the load-bearing capacity of your own imagination and start testing the tensile limits of your own audacity. You stop building for the approval of inspectors who have never left the ground floor and start building for the sheer, unapologetic exhilaration of watching the world shrink beneath you as you expand beyond it. And the debris below is no longer the ruins of your former life, but the foundation of your next ascent. And the sky above is no longer a ceiling, but an invitation. And you are no longer a builder. You are the building. You are the ascent. You are the infinite architecture of a self that refuses to stop becoming. Suppose you discover, at the height of your ascent, perched upon scaffolding that trembles with the resonance of your own expanding belief, that the blueprint you have been consulting, the one you unfurled from your ribcage, the one you believed was the original, eternal design, has begun to move beneath your gaze, its lines not fixed but flowing, its dimensions not static but shifting, its rooms not pre-drawn, but emerging in real time from the pressure of your attention upon the page. And you realize with a vertigo that has nothing to do with physical height, that you are not reading a document but participating in its creation, that the architect is not a distant figure who completed the plans before your birth, but a presence who draws only where your eyes have already fallen, that the blueprint is not a record of what will be, but a negotiation between what you dare to desire and what you have not yet imagined you can desire. This is where the revelation inverts itself. You climb the scaffolding to consult the original plans, to discover once and for all the true shape of your eternal structure, to finally see the finished cathedral that has been waiting for you since before your first breath. And instead you find a blank page that fills itself only as you lean closer, only as you whisper the names of runes you have never entered, but somehow recognize, only as you trace with your fingertip the outline of a tower that did not exist until this exact moment and now cannot be unimagined. This is how it unfolds. The blueprint does not contradict itself, but it does contradict the version of itself you examined yesterday, and the day before that, and the decade before that. And you understand with the force of a revelation that cannot be unreceived that the blueprint was never complete, because you were never complete. That the design was never finished because you were never finished, that the infinite architect did not draw a static eternity and then abandon you to construct it, but instead entered into a covenant with your becoming, a pact that the plans would remain fluid until your very last breath, and perhaps beyond, that every ceiling you have ever shattered is now marked on the page as a skylight, every wall you have ever demolished is now redrawn as a colonnade, every fallen brick is now reimagined as a paving stone on a path that leads not to a destination but deeper into the labyrinth of your own expanding self. Yet something deeper was waiting, and so you must consider the possibility that the blueprint does not merely rewrite itself in response to your achievements, but also in response to your failures. That the smudges where your tears fell across the page are not damage, but dye. That the creases where you folded the document in despair are not flaws but features. That the sections you tore out in frustration and threw into the fire of your own self-doubt have not been lost but have been reabsorbed into the original parchment, their ink redistributed into new lines, their wisdom preserved in the very fibers of the page. And the blueprint that now spreads across your trembling hands is not a second draft, but a cumulative testament to every version of you that has ever tried, and every version that has ever failed, and every version that has ever tried again. This is the revelation that arrives not as a doctrine, but as an experience. The blueprint is not a map of your future, because your future is not a territory to be traversed, but a dimension to be inhabited. Not a sequence of destinations, but a continuous state of arrival. Not a line from A to B, but a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. And the plans shift because you shift, the ink flows because you flow, the boundaries redraw themselves because you have outgrown every boundary that has ever been drawn, including those you drew yourself this morning. Envision a world where you stop searching the blueprint for confirmation of a destiny already written and instead approach it as a co-author approaches a blank page, where you pick up the pen that has been lying in the crease of the binding since before you could hold a tool, where you feel the weight of it in your hand and recognize it not as an instrument of inscription, but as an extension of your own intention. And you understand that the pen has always been there, that the only reason you never saw it was that you were looking for a signature at the bottom of the page rather than a tool resting in the margin, waiting for you to stop reading and start writing. This is why it matters, because the moment you accept the pen, the moment you cease being a contractor executing someone else's vision and become the architect yourself, the entire relationship between builder and blueprint undergoes a phase shift so profound that the old vocabulary collapses, and there is no longer any distinction between the plan and the planner, the design and the designer, the structure and the one who dwells within it, and you realize that the infinite architect was never a separate being who drew your life and handed you the tools. The infinite architect is the version of you who has already completed the structure and is now reaching back through time to leave clues on the page for the version of you who is still climbing the scaffolding. Think of the moment when you write the first word, the first line, the first room that exists nowhere in your history, but announces itself in your imagination with the authority of a memory you have not yet lived. And as the ink flows from the pen you do not recognize as yours, as the new wing of the cathedral extends itself across the parchment, in elevations you have never drafted but instantly recognize as home, you understand that the blueprint has been rewriting itself since the beginning of your existence, that every apparent revision was actually a revelation, every change was actually a confirmation. Every new line was actually the surfacing of a line that has been submerged in the pulp of the page since before paper existed. And you are not creating the design, you are remembering it, you are recovering it, you are finally ceasing to resist the eternal truth that you were never meant to follow a plan, but to become one. This is the turning point. You look down at the blueprint and see not instructions but autobiography, not specifications but testimony, not a construction document, but a confession of love between who you were, who you are, and who you are about to become. And the scaffolding beneath you feels suddenly solid, not because the metal has strengthened, but because you have finally accepted that the ground was never below you. The ground is wherever you decide to stand and call it foundation. Now consider this, that throughout your entire construction, through the laying of borrowed bricks and the application of external mortar, through the decades of maintaining a ceiling you believed was structural, through the demolition and the ascent and the discovery of the living blueprint, there has existed in your eastern wall a window you have never once turned to face. A portal cut into the masonry by hands you do not remember employing, glazed with glass you do not recall importing, framed by timbers you never measured or milled. And it has been admitting light every morning of your existence while your back remained turned to its illumination. And the reason you have never noticed it is not that it was hidden, but that you were trained to face west, to watch the sunset of your own diminishing, to measure your life by the fading of the day rather than by the promise of its renewal. This is where the architecture of your eternal structure reveals its most subversive feature. The window was installed not during your construction, but during your original design, not added as an afterthought, but integral to the blueprint you have only now begun to read with co-authoring eyes, and it faces east because eternity has no interest in your endings, but every interest in your beginnings, because the architect knows that what you most need to see is not where you have been, but where you are about to arrive. Because the light that breaks over the horizon each morning is not merely illumination, but annunciation, not simply brightness, but blessing, not just visibility, but visitation. This is how it unfolds. You have spent your entire construction career facing the western wall, cataloging the shadows as they lengthen across your floor, measuring your progress by the darkness that accumulates in the corners of your unfinished rooms, mistaking the approach of night for the verdict of your existence. And all the while, the eastern window has been standing behind you, like a patient guest who arrived at the first moment of creation and has been waiting silently for you to simply turn around. Suppose you discover that the window does not need to be opened to admit the dawn, that the glass is not a barrier, but a medium, that the light passes through it not because the material is transparent, but because the material has forgotten it was ever separate from the source. And you press your palm against its cool surface and feel not separation but transmission, not boundary but threshold, not the end of your reach but the beginning of light's willingness to be touched. This is the revelation that arrives not as a concept, but as a sensation. The window has been here all along, has always been here, was here before you laid the first brick, and will remain here after the last wall has surrendered to the weather of eternity, and your entire life has been lived in a room that possessed an eastern exposure you never exploited, a view you never consulted, a dawn you never welcomed. And the tragedy is not that the window was hidden, but that you never thought to look behind you. Yet something deeper was waiting. And so you must understand that the window does not reveal the outside world. It reveals the inside world. It reflects not what is external to your structure, but what has always been internal to your being. And the landscape you see through its eastern pane is not geography, but biography. Not topography, but autobiography. Not a territory you must travel to, but a territory you have always been. And the sun rising over those hills is not a celestial body, but the consciousness that has been rising within you since your first breath, slowly, incrementally, degree by impossible degree, until now its upper arc has cleared the horizon of your awareness, and you are finally, fully, irrevocably illuminated from within. This is why it matters, because the window you never noticed is not a feature of your structure, but the purpose of your structure. Not an architectural element, but the reason architecture exists. Not a portal through which you view eternity, but the very mechanism by which eternity views itself through the unique aperture of your existence. And when you finally turn to face it, when you stop measuring the shadows on the western wall and start receiving the radiance from the eastern pane, your entire relationship to construction undergoes a metamorphosis so complete that the word construction itself becomes obsolete, and you are no longer a builder, but a beholder, no longer an architect, but an admirer, no longer a creator, but a creation finally willing to be seen. Envision a world where you do not merely turn toward the window, but step through it, where the glass that you believed was separation reveals itself to be invitation, where the frame that you assumed was boundary reveals itself to be doorway, and you do not cross from interior to exterior, because that distinction has collapsed along with your western-facing orientation, and you are simply here, now, on both sides of the pane simultaneously. The light that enters your room, indistinguishable from the light that emanates from your chest. The dawn outside the window, indistinguishable from the dawn you have become. Think of the moment when you realize that every brick you ever laid was backlit by this window, that every mortar application was illuminated by this eastern radiance, that every demolition and ascent and blueprint revision occurred within a room that was flooded with a light you refused to acknowledge, and the only darkness you ever experienced was the shadow cast by your own refusal to turn around. And now that you have turned, now that your face is finally lifted toward the source, you understand that there was never any darkness except the density of your own inattention, and that density is dissolving in the morning of your awakening. This is the turning point. You stop facing west. You stop cataloging endings. You stop measuring your life by the shadows it casts, and you take up permanent residence at the eastern window, not as a spectator but as a participant, not as an observer but as the observed. And the light that pours through the glass pours through you. And the glass itself, having fulfilled its function of separating you from what you were not ready to receive, now fulfills its deeper function of ceasing to exist. And there is no longer window, no longer wall, no longer inside or outside, no longer builder or building, no longer seeker or found. There is only light, and you are the light's recognition of itself. And the dawn is not approaching, but arriving. And the arrival is not external, but internal. And the interior is not a room, but a universe. And the universe is not a location, but a condition. And the condition is not temporary but eternal. And eternity is not a duration, but a window you finally have the courage to face. Picture for a moment that you have traversed the scaffolding, that you have co-authored the blueprint, that you have turned from the western wall and stood transfixed at the eastern window, that the light has poured through you and the glass has dissolved, and the distinction between beholder and beheld has collapsed into incandescent unity. And yet, and this is the discovery that arrives not as disappointment, but as depth, there remains in your eternal structure one chamber you have never entered, one doorway you have never crossed, one room whose door bears no handle on your side, and yet you know, with the same certainty that recognizes your own face in still water, that the handle on the other side has been turned downward for decades, waiting for you to simply push. This is where the architecture reveals its final, most generous secret. The unfinished room is not incomplete because you lacked the skill to finish it, not abandoned because you ran out of materials or time or belief, but deliberately, lovingly, strategically left unfinished so that you would have somewhere to go, something to become, someone to meet in the space between your current self and the self who has been waiting on the other side of that door since before you learned to walk. This is how it unfolds. You stand before the door not with trepidation, but with recognition, not with fear, but with the peculiar calm that descends when you finally stop running from an appointment that was never a threat, but an invitation, and you place your palm against the wood and feel not separation but the faint vibration of occupancy, the subtle resonance of a presence moving through rooms on the other side, arranging furniture, adjusting curtains, lighting lamps in preparation for a guest who has been expected for so long that expectation has mellowed into the quiet confidence of inevitability. Suppose you discover that the unfinished room is not a construction site awaiting your attention, but a completed sanctuary awaiting your occupancy, that every beam has been cut to your exact specifications by a carpenter you do not remember hiring, that every wall has been plastered and painted in colors you have only ever glimpsed in dreams, that every surface has been dusted and polished by hands that move with the unhurried precision of those who work not for wages, but for love. And the only reason the room has remained unfinished in your perception is that you have never stayed still long enough to realize that the construction was completed the moment you first dared to imagine it. This is the revelation that arrives not as thunder, but as the soft click of a latch releasing under the pressure of your intention. The door was never locked. You were never locked out. The absence of a handle on your side was not an exclusion, but a design feature, a deliberate invitation to recognize that the only barrier between you and the room you most desire to inhabit is the belief that you need someone else to open the door, that you require permission, that you must be invited, that the threshold can only be crossed from the other direction, and now, with your palm flat against the grain, you understand that the invitation was issued at the moment of your birth and has been renewed with every beat of your heart. And the only response it has ever awaited is your willingness to push. Yet something deeper was waiting, and so you must consider the possibility that the unfinished room is not a single chamber but a recursive series, that every door you open reveals not a destination but a corridor, that every threshold you cross deposits you not in completion but at the threshold of another door identical to the first. And the architecture of eternity is not a finite set of rooms to be successively occupied, but an infinite regress of invitation. An endless hallway of handles turned downward, an unbroken succession of sanctuaries, each more beautiful than the last, each more aligned with your deepest longing, each more indistinguishable from the version of you who dwells within it. This is why it matters. Because the unfinished room is not evidence of your failure to complete your life, but evidence of your life's refusal to be completed. Not a mark of inadequacy, but a signature of infinitude. Not a space you have neglected, but a space that has been protecting you from the false conclusion that arrival is the point, that finishing is the goal, that a life can be wrapped in brown paper and tied with string and placed on a shelf labeled complete, and the room remains unfinished because you remain unfinished. And you remain unfinished Because eternity remains unfinished. And eternity remains unfinished because the architect, in their infinite wisdom, designed a creation that could not be completed without your participation, and then stepped back into the silence of the eastern window to watch you discover, door by door, room by room, threshold by impossible threshold, that the only completion is the perpetual act of becoming. Envision a world where you finally push the door open, where the resistance you anticipated dissolves into the effortless swing of well-oiled hinges, where you cross the threshold not as a conqueror claiming territory, but as a child coming home from a long journey to find that nothing has changed except everything. And the room receives you, not as an occupant, but as an organ receives blood, not as a house receives a tenant, but as a lung receives breath, not as a vessel receives its contents, but as a flame receives oxygen. And the distinction between you and the room collapses into the same unity you experienced at the eastern window. And you understand that every room in your eternal structure is an eastern window. Every threshold is a sunrise. Every door is a pane of glass that dissolves when you stop treating it as a barrier and start treating it as an invitation to become what you are beholding. Think of the moment when you look around the room you have avoided your entire existence and realize that it is not unfamiliar. It is the room you have been furnishing in your imagination since childhood. The room whose dimensions you have measured in your sleep. The room whose curtains you have adjusted in reverie. The room whose windows you have washed with your own breath and the sleeve of your most vulnerable self. And it is not that you have finally arrived here, but that you have never truly lived anywhere else. And your decades of construction and demolition and ascent were not journeys toward this room, but journeys within this room. Explorations of a territory you already inhabited, but refused to recognize as home. This is the turning point. You stop treating the unfinished room as a project and start treating it as a presence. You stop asking what you need to do to complete it and start asking who you need to become to receive it. You stop measuring the distance between where you are and where you want to be, and realize that distance is an illusion sustained by a clock that measures motion but cannot measure growth. And the room is not ahead of you, but within you. Not waiting for you, but waiting as you. Not a destination to be reached, but a self to be claimed. And the claiming requires no construction, no demolition, no ascent, no blueprint revision. It requires only the simple, devastating act of believing that what you most desire is not something you build, but something you already are, and that the door was never closed and the room was never unfinished, and you were never separate from the sanctuary you have been seeking since before you learned to seek. Ask yourself, what happens when you have finally occupied the unfinished room, when the door has swung shut behind you and the handle has settled into its cradle, when the furniture arranged by unseen hands welcomes your weight, and the curtains catch the same eastern light that dissolved the window in the outer chamber, and you begin to examine the details of this sanctuary with the reverence of a pilgrim who has arrived at the innermost shrine, your fingers tracing the grain of the wooden mantle, your eyes following the cornice molding around the perimeter of the ceiling, your breath syncing with the ancient rhythm of a space that has been holding its breath since before your great-grandparents drew their first. And there, in the corner where the light pools most generously, you notice a small table supporting a single object, a rolled parchment tied with a crimson ribbon. Its ends frayed as though tied and retied 1,000 times by fingers both patient and urgent. This is where the architecture finally reveals its author. You approach the table not with the curiosity of a tourist, but with the recognition of a lover approaching a familiar gesture. Your hands moving not with the hesitation of uncertainty, but with the muscle memory of emotion performed 10,000 times in dreams you have forgotten upon waking. And you untie the ribbon and you unroll the parchment, and there, at the bottom of a page that contains no specifications, no elevations, no structural calculations, no material schedules, you find a signature. Not printed, not stamped, not engraved, but written in the same ink that flowed from the pen you found in the margin of the living blueprint, written in a hand you have seen before in the margins of your own journals, written in the slope and flourish of a signature you have been practicing since grade school without ever understanding why the loops felt so familiar. This is how it unfolds. The signature is your own, and yet it is not your own, for it carries the weight of an authority you have never claimed, the confidence of a hand that has never doubted its right to sign the bottom of a creation, the patience of a calligrapher who has spent eternity perfecting the curve of a single letter, and you recognize it simultaneously as the name your mother gave you, and as a designation so vast that no alphabet could contain it, as the identity you have carried through every failure and triumph, and as an essence that precedes language itself. Suppose you discover that the signature is not at the bottom of the page, because that's where architects sign, but because the page is a petition, and you are the grantor. Not because the document requires authentication, but because the document is a deed, and you are the original title holder. Not because the ink needed to dry, but because the ink has been wet since before the first atom cohered. Waiting for your fingertip to finally press into it, and leave the print that will complete the transfer of ownership from the architect who drew the plans to the architect who lives within them. This is the revelation that arrives not as discovery, but as remembering. The signature has been there all along, has always been there, was there before the blueprint existed, because the blueprint exists only as an extension of the signature, only as the signature's self-expression in the language of line and dimension, only as the signature's attempt to render itself visible across the medium of space and time. And you have been searching the document for the author's mark, while the author's mark has been bleeding through the parchment from the other side, soaking the fibers with the indelible ink of your own forgotten authority. Yet something deeper was waiting, and so you must understand that the signature is not merely your name, but your nature, not merely your identity, but your identity's origin, not merely the answer to who built this, but the answer to who is this built for. And the two answers are identical. The builder and the beneficiary are one. The architect and the occupant are the same being regarding themselves across the impossible distance of linear time, and the signature is the bridge across that distance. The declaration that the distance was always illusory, the testimony that you have never been separate from the version of yourself who drew the first line on the first page and whispered, "Let there be light." This is why it matters, because the discovery of your own signature on the blueprint of eternity is not an ending but a beginning, not a conclusion but an initiation, not the final answer to a lifelong question, but the first question you have ever asked that is worthy of an infinite response. And the signature does not close the case but opens the dossier, does not seal the document but renders it permanently amendable, does not authenticate a completed work but authorizes all future revisions. And you are no longer a contractor executing a plan or a co-author adding marginal notes, but the sole, sovereign, signatory authority whose name at the bottom of the page is the only permit eternity requires. Envision a world where you pick up the pen that lies beside the parchment, the same pen that rested in the crease of the living blueprint, the same pen whose ink flows not from a reservoir but from the wellspring of your own revised self-concept. And you do not sign your name because your name is already signed. You trace the signature, you follow the loops and lines that your hand has been practicing since before it could hold a tool. You press the nib into the wet ink and leave the microscopic evidence of your presence. And in that tracing, in that superimposition of your living hand upon the eternal mark, you become not the signer of the document, but the document itself, not the author of the signature, but the signature's incarnation. Not the one who writes, but the one who is written. Think of the moment when you realize that the signature at the bottom of the page is not a conclusion, but a covenant. Not a possessive declaration, but a participial invitation. Not, "I built this," but "I am becoming this." And the ink is not dry because the construction is not complete. And the construction is not complete because the architect is not complete. And the architect is not complete because the architect is you. And you are not complete because you are still learning the full reach of your own signature, still discovering the weight and heft of your own authority, still practicing the loops and flourishes of a name that expands with every utterance. This is the turning point. You stop searching the blueprint for evidence of a distant architect and start examining your own hands for traces of indigo ink. You stop waiting for permission to build and start recognizing that every brick you have ever laid bears the watermark of your own approval. You stop treating your name as a label applied from without and start treating it as a lens through which eternity focuses itself into the particular, irreducible radiance of a single signatory life. And the signature at the bottom of the page is no longer a mystery to be solved, but a mirror to be faced. And in that mirror you see not your face, but the face of the one who has been signing your name since before names existed. And the face is your own, and the name is your own, and the mirror is your own, and the reflection is the only original document you have ever been authorized to amend.